Welcome back to Data Driven Recruiting. My name is Sophia Beck, and I'm joined by my co-host Tigran Sloyan. Hi,
Hey,
hi
Sophia.
Tigran.
Hey, Sophia. We're back to remote data-driven recruiting filmings. I'm getting used to this. So even when we're allowed to go back to in person, this might be the way to go. So
yeah, this is nice. Okay, well, so today's topic, I think it's a really, really interesting one. Let's talk about the pros and cons of, automated assessment versus human-driven assessment in technical recruiting.
Absolutely. And just to kind of clarify what each one means, right? So
yeah, let's start
I sometimes
there.
call them like an automated interview versus a human-driven interview, because when you say assessment, people don't really know what that means because everything is an assessment. So almost everybody knows what an interview is. So let's clarify what's an automated interview, what's a human-driven interview. Automated interview is known by many names. Some call it a take-home test, some call it a coding challenge, but I prefer automated interview because I think it sets high expectations, first of all, from what your assessment should be able to accomplish. Because when you call it something else, you have inevitably lowering your expectations of the signal that you're going to get. Whereas an automated interview is what it should be, right? It should be getting as good of a signal as a human could have gotten, but in an automated way.
Right.
Which is, very familiar to most people. It's an engineer gets on the phone with a candidate, asks them some questions within an hour, and then sees how well they perform. Some of these are done just completely just over the phone. Others are done when there is some sort of an opportunity to code together, either through screen share or some sort of a tool that helps you collaborate together on a piece of code and understand how well you've performed. And then it's on the human to judge how well you've done and do you move forward or not. So now that we have the definitions are more or less clear, I'm hoping, in terms of...
Yeah, and I think, so the automated interview, I guess the difference between that and, something people will call take-home test, it would be, I think, first, the accuracy and the level of a signal you're getting on that person's skill. And then I guess another point would be that take-home test, it doesn't have to be automated, right? You just send it off. People can take hours, or days and days. And then it comes back, and then you have to just review. So it's different from that in that it's meant to also increase the efficiency of that, and also make, leveling the playing field. Because, if one person does take 3 days to work on a problem versus another person 2 hours, that's a completely different playing field. So that's great. Okay, and then the human-driven one, it can be both physical, like in person, as well as online, right?
Yep. The other thing about automated interviews is that it would ideally replace a human interview instead of being an additional step. So a lot of people, when they say coding challenge or a take-home assessment, they think of it as a pre-filter after which there's one human interview probably over the phone, and then you go to an on-site interview. When I say automated interview, that means you do it instead of a human interview. So you save the time that engineer was going to spend. And I guess it's a good kind of moment to jump into what are the pros and cons, right? What's the disadvantages?
Yeah, why not automate it all? It sounds so great.
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's, start from the benefits of why you should automate them all. First of all, it's saving engineering time, right? If you're hiring, if you're scaling, obviously you don't have enough engineers. So if you're spending those engineering hours on interviews, and many of them end up being not successful interviews, that means you've just wasted even more in a situation where you don't. Now you're taking that supply of engineering deficit and then putting it towards an activity that's meant to fix it. So it creates a lot of frictions.
The problem.
Especially at high growth companies. High growth companies, unicorn companies, in many cases are trying to double their engineering workforce. When you're trying to double your engineering workforce and you're having your engineers conduct all of these interviews, all of a sudden your product is in a state of paralysis where they cannot do anything because they're just sitting on interviews, because you've got
Yeah,
a
'cause
small engineering team.
Yeah, every day your calendar, you have 2 or 3, interviews on your calendar. That means also switching costs. If you're in the mode, in the state of coding and like solving problems, to like suddenly you have to talk to somebody and then get to know them, assess their skills, and then coming back, I think it just throws off not just the exact time that they are spending on interviewing, but just the overall. And I mean,
Absolutely.
also talk about, it's like you have to train them to conduct good interview, right? So it's not like you can just like throw somebody in and that's it, right? You have to, prep them. They have to spend time thinking about what questions to ask, how to ask, what are we assessing, and also, debrief and pre-brief, all that stuff. So it is a lot of hours we're talking about.
And like writing down feedback after the call as well, right? So, but I think the most underappreciated portion of how much effort it takes from a single engineer to conduct an interview is that switching cost, as well as the demotivation from having just been on an unsuccessful interview, right? Because switching cost is one thing, but when you just came off feeling like you just wasted an hour for no good reason, it's really demotivating to be able to get back in the groove of like solving problems and working on a product. So I think that portion is hard to measure, but I feel like it's a massive component of the engineering hours wasted. But that's not the only reason. That's not the only advantage, right? Like another huge advantage when it comes to the candidate experience piece is the freedom of scheduling. Like when you have to do a human-driven interview, you have to align schedules, and most great candidates are employed right now and have their day job, right? So when you're trying to schedule an interview with somebody, you have to align schedules. I have to find a place to hide from my current employer and like call with you on work hour. Whereas in an automated state, I can do it on my couch tonight while sipping some, wine on the side, and my feet up somewhere, right? Just so I'm like relaxed, and I don't have to be stressed out regarding taking an hour in the middle of work to do it. And then last but not least, it's the comfort of doing something without being watched by another human being, because that's also, it's not a good simulation of the job. Because if you're interviewing someone, ideally your interview is a simulation of what they'll be doing on the job, and being watched and potentially critiqued on what you're doing is not necessarily a good simulation of the job. So
Go ahead.
Yeah, in an automated state, you're just sitting there by yourself, and which is way more realistic rather than being watched and having to talk through what you're doing, which is another problem, right? Like most of the time you're not expected to sit there silently and do it. You're supposed to talk and do it, which adds a multitasking, which again is not necessarily part of evaluation for the job. It's just a byproduct of a human-driven interview.
Right. So you can kind of think through problems and doesn't have to necessarily get, interrupted every, other line when you're writing code and then asked to explain why did you just do that, right? So
exactly,
you can see that the pressure is less. And when the pressure is less in terms of like just their comfortable state, I think that really helps candidates to do their best, right? And that's what we want to know, not necessarily how this person work under pressure, but like how this person can solve a technical problem in a normal state. Yeah.
Yep.
It makes sense.
And I guess, last but not least, I'll mention one more point, and we can talk about some of the advantages of doing a human-driven interview, because it sounds so far that there's only disadvantages. But I'll mention one more disadvantage, which is very important. So that it's the bias, right? Like when you do early on human-driven interviews, you just cannot control the bias. I mean, I know a lot of, large, well-known companies who really care about having an equitable process. Their interviewers, which again, time spent not building the product, which is the main job of that engineer. They do have trainings, but there is a lot of research that shows that no matter how much training you have, the unconscious bias that exists, that's triggered by everything from seeing the person's face to hearing their voice, every single little thing triggers a bias and can potentially skew the interview result versus something. The gender, the color of the skin of the candidate didn't come into play because the automated assessment doesn't care at all what you look or sound like. It's all about have you been able to perform the task that was given to you.
Right. It's almost like enabling like the unconscious bias. Because it's unconscious, it's really hard to get rid of it altogether. Like I think we can try to reduce it as much, but yeah, it's definitely there. And if you have an option of not introducing the bias as a structural process, I think that's definitely a great advantage.
Yep. All right. Well, so let's talk about some of the advantages. Yeah.
Right. Of the human involved interview process.
Yeah. So the main advantages of the human-driven interview is actually the human connection there, right? So like when you're talking to an engineer information that you're going to be joining, it's like you're almost interviewing them, right? Like you want to see how they think, how do they approach collaboration. So it's more of a giving a candidate an opportunity to interview the company, which is just as important. Like interview is a bit, it's not a one-way street because eventually tables are turned if you give the candidate an offer or they need to make based on their interactions with your company. So when it comes to kind of a human-driven interview, one big advantage is it's an opportunity to represent your company and a relationship that can lead to hopefully a very positive experience from a candidate. It gives a candidate an opportunity to ask about engineering culture. It gives an opportunity to ask about how you do certain things, and just creates kind of an opportunity for your engineer conducting the interview to really sell the company, to represent it in a way where the candidate can feel very kind of good about it at the end of the day.
Right.
So that's one.
Yes. And kind of to follow up on that, candidate, they want to know that the colleagues and peers that they are going to work with is at a certain level, right? The caliber, she needs to be there. So you want to make sure also during that interview, this person actually is someone I can learn from and I'd like to collaborate with. So that is an important step before you make a decision to go work for somebody. You do want to meet the people who are going to be my colleagues and make sure that's there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the second main advantage of human-driven interviews is just the slightly more nuanced approach a human can take, from giving slight hints whenever the person gets stuck to, potentially adjusting the question by understanding their skill level or by taking it into a different direction. And again, you want to be doing it very carefully because by adjusting the question too much, you can again potentially break the structure of the interview and introduce bias in there. But an interviewer that's highly experienced can be a little bit more fluid in the assessment of the candidate by adjusting the narrative or the approach in the middle of the interview and getting a more precise signal than what an automated interview can produce.
Right. You can, as an interview, you can ask the candidate ask the candidate to repeat the question and see whether candidate actually understood the question correctly. If you see that, the candidate is going into the different direction, then you can kind of stop and, hey, let's kind of clarify. What do you think is the question being asked? And then really help them just get unstuck. Because it's not about maybe the question was not clear in the description or how it's asked. And, that's not necessarily, dependent on the candidate's skill set. So as a interviewer who's very experienced, I think you can, intervene in the middle and then course correct as they go so that they can really focus on the skill, right?
Yep. And just to comment on that, and as practice, I don't think the interviewer should be, even if they're really experienced, they shouldn't be the one playing the initial prompt of the question because humans are very bad at being consistent with their explanations. So ideally, the question should be written down. So whatever tool you're using, when you're asking the candidate a question, ideally you give them a short write-up of, here's the question, please read it. And that's just done for consistency, right? Because if it's left to the interviewer to describe the initial prompt, I mean, depending on if they are having a good day or a bad day, or if this is before lunch or after lunch, I might explain it well, or I might completely wing it. And depending on that, all of a sudden you've got an advantage or a disadvantage for the candidate, which is not good. So ideally you want written down explanation, which if the candidate has follow-up questions on, you can explain, but you don't want that initial prompt to be just in the interview or two and hope that they do a good job every time.
Right. And then also if there are more than one interview and you have a structured interview process where you ask the same question, then different people can explain problems in different ways and give advantage to one or the other. And I guess that's another part. I mean, you can also argue that candidates' ability to read instructions and understand the problem quickly is a part of the problem solving skills, right? And you can, and it can be more of like if this question has been solved by, hundreds of candidates and they were able to interpret it correctly and then proceed. And, then you see one candidate who's completely off. I think that could be also, one can argue, it's about their ability to understand the problem. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Any other advantages about having a human-driven interview?
I think that's mostly it. And I think kind of if we're talking about the bottom line, just to kind of summarize the way I think our approach is I think both have their, I just think they have to be in a slightly different place in the process, right? So most phone technical interviews are meant to just be, hey, let's determine like some basic bar, just so we can say, should we bring this candidate on site? Should we spend several hours with them doing a human-driven interview? So human-driven interviews are going to be there regardless. So the question is like, do you have them both on site as well as on a phone interview stage, or do you just have them on site? I do think most phone interviews should just go into an automated interview, because the automated interview can very quickly tell you if the candidate meets the minimum bar for you to commit to an on-site, and it can do it while having all of the advantages we talked about, right? It can have the freedom of scheduling, it can have the consistency of the interview, it can have all of the other benefits that we talked about, and then you still get the other component when they come on site. When they come on site, they still get to meet your engineers and understand your engineering culture. You do get to do a little bit more nuanced and like exactly understand where their skill level is. So you do get all the other benefits when you're interviewing them on an on-site stage. So you don't have to do it twice to get all of the benefits that we talked about from a human-based interview.
I see. So bottom line is both have great pros. And ideally, you want to structure the automated interview to come first so that you can save a lot of time and get good signals. And then kind of end with the human-driven interview where you can get another depth and another kind of a perspective on the candidate's assessment.
Yeah. And I guess one thing we didn't touch about the automated interview coming first, it just gives you leverage to really talk to a lot versus just kind of having to interview as many people as your engineers could interview. But an automated one, you really can like open up the funnel and assess a lot more people than you otherwise could.
Right, because the cost of doing technical assessment is lower from the employer's perspective. So you can give benefit of doubts and just say, hey, anybody who can solve this and do well, just come talk to us. We want to hire you.
It just gives leverage. It's massive leverage.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's very important, especially a lot of times recruiters feel like they don't have enough qualified candidates. But if with this approach, you can really widen your net and identify candidates who are really good. But, maybe you wouldn't have been able to keep a benefit of doubt in the first place. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your insights today. And thanks for joining us. For more tips and advice on data-driven recruiting, please visit ddr.codesignal.com.